Power, live from Washington, D.C.
Studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. Welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Tyler Kendall in our Washington Bureau alongside Joe Matthew live from Capitol Hill.
Tonight we are following breaking news. 7 hours to midnight and key voting underway on a series of amendments as the Senate scrambles to avoid a government shutdown. There's also breaking news tonight involving the BLS, and we're about to get fresh reaction to the president's pick of Kevin Warsh to be the next Fed chair. Joining us right now live from Capitol Hill is Democratic Senator of Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, of course, the ranking member on the Senate Banking and Housing Committees. It's great to see you, Senator. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. So here we are, and we're understanding that this could be wrapped up in a matter of an hour or so. Yep. The deal, as you understand it, on the table between Democrats and President Trump to put new restrictions on ICE are enough for you to vote yes tonight?
Well, remember, this is only the first step in getting those restrictions in place. We've got 6 funding bills. The Democrats have said 5 can go forward, but that 6th one that includes ICE funding, no, that one has to stop. And we're going to put some serious restrictions in place before ICE gets more money. You're
obviously counting, though, on to have another bill to vote on in the next 2 weeks.
Yes.
This is a 2-week CR. The president says he's on board with some Democratic demands. No masks, body cameras, additional training. Will you get all of those?
Look, the bottom line is to say that ICE officers have to act like every other officer in public safety. If our officers in Massachusetts, in Boston, and in Springfield, and all across Massachusetts, and all across this country, can abide by an ordinary set of rules that anybody can see their face, everybody knows their name, and if there's an officer involved shooting, there's an independent investigation. Those are the things we're asking for here with ICE. ICE is out of control. ICE is marching down the streets saying they own the town, they own the streets. They push citizens, they kick in people's front doors to their homes. And of course, we've seen the shootings in broad daylight. We have to put a stop to this, and the United States Congress is the place to do that.
You support targeted enforcement of criminals, as the president promised, the worst of the worst, or however he put it, and you see these as two different things when you have roving squads of ICE officers in an American city.
You know, the big promise that Donald Trump made was he was going to keep us all safer. And he claimed he was going to do that by getting the worst of the worst. Those were his words. People had criminal histories who were putting us at risk. Instead, it's turned exactly on its head. ICE itself is putting American citizens at risk. And we got to put a stop to that. And I want to put in one more pitch. I talk to a lot of police officers, and they say to me they've worked hard to build up credibility in their communities, to make sure that their officers are fully trained in how to deal with crowds, how to deal with protesters, how to deal with people who disagree with them. And then they turn around and watch ICE just burn down every bit of credibility that those police officers have been building. They're pretty unhappy about it, too.
I want to ask you about Kevin Warsh, but just to be clear, is 2 weeks enough time, and do you need to see Kristi Noem no longer the head of Homeland Security?
So look, I've been calling for Kristi Noem to be pushed out of there.
Should that be part of a deal?
I would love to see that as part of a deal. But the core of what we're asking for here, it shouldn't take us 2 hours to write this and put it together. It's abide by the same sets of restrictions
so 2 weeks is
that
plenty.
Every other public safety officer abides by.
You have big questions for Kevin Warsh. I don't know if you saw this one coming. We thought maybe it would be one of the Kevins, and here we are. The president has made it clear Tom Tillis is standing in the way of this nomination, and it sounds like there are several members of the Banking Committee who have some big questions. Does he support this criminal investigation into Jay Powell?
Well, that's an interesting question,
isn't it?
Because here's the fundamental question. Do we really have a nominee who will be independent of the president? And as you know, the reason we talk about Fed independence is because we want a Federal Reserve that's making decisions on things like interest rates based on their best assessment, whether you agree with them or not, their best assessment of the economics of what's happening in the country, what the data show, not based on politics. Because every president will be tempted to say before an election, ooh, let's cut those interest rates and juice the economy, even though it has terrible long-term consequences for families and will drive down job formation and drive up prices. So Donald Trump has made clear he wants he does not want an independent Fed. He wants a Fed that acts like a sock puppet for him. He has threatened to fire Jerome Powell. He started a bogus investigation of another member of the Fed, Lisa Cook. And he has said openly he will not name anyone to be Fed chair who does not agree with Donald Trump. Donald Trump wants to be calling the shots. In other words, he said he wants a sock puppet, and evidently Kevin Warsh just passed that test.
Well, he's a known entity. You've probably had some conversations, I'm guessing, over the years with Kevin Warsh. Is he a hawk or a dove? I keep seeing the word reinvented, new styling.
You got it exactly right. This is what troubles me about him. For 15 years, the man has been a hawk. Remember, he's been on the Fed before.
Yes.
Back during the 2008 crash, when millions of people were losing their jobs and economists were across the country were saying, lower those interest rates. He was the guy who kept saying, raise the interest rates, keep them up. He has been known as an interest rate and inflation hawk for years and years, right up until Donald Trump wins the presidency, makes clear that he wants a Federal Reserve chair who's going to lower interest rates. And suddenly it appears that Kevin Warsh has had an epiphany. And everything he thought in all those years beforehand, he no longer thinks. Now, you know what that says to me? It says to me that the guy is not independent, that he is willing to do whatever Donald Trump wants.
I know you need to go vote now and run back to the floor. Will you wait to have a hearing on this nomination until that investigation is complete?
I want to be clear. We shouldn't be having a hearing until Donald Trump has dropped this bogus investigation, frankly, both of Jerome Powell and of Lisa Cook. As long as Donald Trump is mounting a takeover of the Fed, all of the senators, Democrats and Republicans, who talk about independence of the Fed should say, we're not going forward with any nominations.
I'm not going to be the reason why you missed this vote, Senator. Thank you so much for being with us on Bloomberg. Of course, that's Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. We'll have a lot more from Capitol Hill in just a couple of moments. Let's go back to Tyler in the Bureau for more. Tyler?
All right, Joe, great conversation with Senator Elizabeth Warren there. And for more and analysis on what those two were just discussing, let's bring in Bloomberg's Michael McKee, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. So, Mike, we just heard Senator Elizabeth Warren say that she is troubled by Kevin Warsh's previous hawkish inflation views and then more recent calls to lower rates. Can you just give us a little bit of a fact check here? Take us through how Kevin Warsh's policy views have actually evolved.
Well, he was very much a hawk when he was on the Fed in 2006 to 2011. Interest rates went down as far as zero, and he resisted most of the rate cuts at that time, thinking the economy didn't need it. And since then, he has evolved, and that evolution has taken place mostly over the last 2 years. And it, some would say, is because he wanted to get the Fed job. But it is also true that he has looked at some of the same economics that Chris Waller has on the Fed, arguing that because of AI, because of the increased business investment that we're getting because of that, and also with Trump's deregulatory actions, that's going to make it possible for growth to be faster and therefore inflation slower at the same time. And you don't have to cut interest rates that far. Now, that may or may not happen, but it's a defensible economic argument.
So, Mike, you actually spoke earlier today with Fed Governor Stephen Miran. Tomorrow is supposed to be his last day, but he's saying that he's going to stay in place until somebody else is confirmed to the seat. Let's take a listen to some of what he told you earlier.
As you say, my term expires over the weekend, but per the Federal Reserve Act, I'll be staying in my seat until someone is confirmed to replace me, presumably Chairman-designate Kevin Warsh. This is common practice and has happened many times by other governors who have waited for someone else to be confirmed into their seat.
Mike, do we have any sense on how long this process could play out, how long Stephen Miran could maintain that seat until we see a potential confirmation of Kevin Warsh?
Well, in theory, indefinitely. I think what you do is you back time this from the time that Jay Powell's term is over as chair, which would be May 23rd. The Senate has shown that it can move very quickly, as it does with Stephen Miran, to get somebody confirmed when they want to. At least the Republicans can, and they will be in charge during this whole period. So it then then becomes a question of how fast the Senate banking committees can schedule something and what kind of deal they can make with the holdouts, particularly Senator Tillis. My suspicion is that because there's no indictment of anybody at the Fed, including Jay Powell, these are just subpoenas for information, that it would be fairly easy to make this disappear, to say we didn't find anything wrong. If the president wants to pursue this and actually see Jay Powell in the dock, then it makes it very hard for him to get his choice onto the Fed, because the president will the chair will stay in his position. And while he might not be chair anymore, everybody's still going to look to him after his term is up if he's still serving as a governor, and he'll still be essentially the leader of the group.
Mike, before we let you go, if we didn't have enough breaking news today, the Wall Street Journal is now reporting that President Trump is going to tap a veteran BLS staffer to run the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What does this mean for the president's future economic agenda, considering we know that he already had to withdraw one nomination when it came to who would run the BLS?
Well, the good thing is with Brett Matsumoto, he's elevating a career BLS employee. He's worked there since 2015, and he gets very strong reviews from some of his co-workers who were with him. Omar Sharif, who worked there as well, said that he has a good deal of experience with the agency, a smart, skilled research economist who understands the nuances of the data. And that's what people are looking for. When the president fired Erica McIntyre for the bogus reason of politicizing the data, and then tried to put in Steve Antonio, who was someone who argued with the president that there was some political shenanigans underway. That didn't go over very well, and it became clear that he would not get confirmed by the Senate. I don't think, from what we know about Mr. Matsumoto, that he'll have any trouble getting confirmed, and this just puts a career employee back in charge of the agency.
All right. Bloomberg's Michael McKee, who has been reporting since before the sun came up today. Mike, thanks as always. And for a look at how the markets reacted to the announcement of Kevin Warsh as the president's Fed pick, let's turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Hey,
yeah, it was another wild day on Wall Street. Some of that tied to what went on with the nomination, or the announcement of Kevin Warsh as the potential nominee for the Fed chair. But some of this really has to do with the end of the month here. There were a lot of trades being unwound here on the final trading day of January, a month where we saw all of the major indices end up in the green. But that really kind of obscured the volatility in between. Most of the gains we had this month, they actually came in the first week and a half of January. It's been somewhat of a downdrift ever since. In fact, the S&P, the Dow, the NASDAQ, name them all, they were all down in the red on the day, and with the exception of the S&P, also fell on a weekly basis. Some of the biggest moves, though, and we've been talking about this all week long, Tyler, you're going to find that in the commodities space, whether it's that big bump up that we saw in oil, or what now is an almost unprecedented drop that we saw in precious metals. Gold prices on a daily basis, they fell the most since 1983. Silver prices plunged more than 20%. You have to go all the way back to 1950 to see a drop of that magnitude. And it gets to this idea, Tyler, the idea that this is a market, whether it's going up or down, that is incredibly volatile right now. And a lot of that volatility, I hate to break it to you, is coming from your neck of the woods right down there in Washington.
Right, an entire week where we have spoken about whether or not the administration views the currency, whether they want weak or strong, and how that is actually fueled by unpredictable policymaking here in Washington. Romaine, I was talking to Mike about how it's just been a breaking news day here, and right before we came to the air, there was some breaking news when it came to Disney. The Wall Street Journal reporting that CEO Bob Iger plans to leave his role before his contract ends. What's been the reaction? What do we know about what's going to happen here?
Well, there's been a lot of speculation about this. Remember, Iger's contract is set to expire at the end of this year. So there's been a lot of talk as to when Disney would make an announcement as to who his replacement would be. Remember, he retired once. They brought in Bob Chapek. They weren't satisfied with him and brought Iger back. The idea was that Iger was only supposed to stick around for, maybe a few months, but he's been there now for a while. They need to find someone else. So the Wall Street Journal is saying that this company, the board, I should say, will actually make a vote on this week. Keep in mind, they report earnings on Monday before the bell. Now, we don't expect that vote to come prior to that, but of course, they're going to be peppered with a lot of questions. No one really seems to know know. Is this going to be an internal candidate, somebody who's already there, or have they found someone outside of the Disney ecosystem to kind of take this company to the next level? And as you know, Tyler, this company has changed a lot. You talk about the advent of streaming and everything else. And of course, whatever's going on with this potential sale of Warner Brothers to Netflix and Paramount, the idea that Disney really has to look to the future now and find somebody who can guide it.
He follows all of it for us. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you so much, as always. And for more, let's turn now back to Capitol Hill, where Joe Matthew is standing by with a special guest. Hey, Joe.
Yeah, Tyler, thank you so much. We turn back to our big story now, a potential government shutdown that could be averted or at least abbreviated. With the Senate voting now, the nomination of Kevin Warsh and that impending partial shutdown, we attack all these stories with former Congressman, former Speaker Emeritus Patrick McHenry, former chair of the House Financial Services Committee and now a Bloomberg Politics contributor. Mr. Chairman, great to see you. Welcome back.
Always great to be with you.
You know this feeling. Here we are. The votes are taking place. We're counting down to a shutdown. It looks like we will shut down, but it will be very brief. If you were still running the House of Representatives, would you have members back here on Monday to answer whatever takes place tonight?
Well, I think the Speaker is making the right call to get members back Sunday. Monday's going to be a long day, though, and the pressure has to build in order for the House to come to a reasonable conclusion. Time is a key element, and pressure is a key element to have a solid House vote, and the Speaker's managing that fairly well.
How are Republicans managing the rewriting of this DHS funding bill? We saw 5 Republican senators vote no on the package yesterday. Were you surprised by some of those names? It wasn't just Rand Paul, it's Mike Lee, it's Ted Budd, who joined us yesterday to talk about his philosophy here. Where is the Republican conference on restrictions for ICE?
Well, there are a couple things. So appropriations bills are a classic problem for Republicans to pass, because even if you're paring down government, you're still funding government.
Yes.
And there are a lot of policies that ride with government funding bills. So you look at those Republican senators voting no, they did it for a variety of different reasons, not ICE related primarily. And so that doesn't really speak to ICE or the current situation. It speaks to the overall challenge of funding the government as a limited government party, or an alleged limited government party. And so what is interesting right now, and I think is informative, is that deal making occurred very quickly.
It did.
In response, we had the Senate take very quick action, a week's time, and the Senate is like lightning speed.
No doubt.
And so they've come to a reasonable conclusion on how to keep the government open. And I think that should be commended. The deal making should be commended, and the response should be commended. And a reasonable set of governance initiatives are going to make their way through. And then the sticky stuff of how to fund DHS remains for the next.
So is 2 weeks enough? They've got a CR 2 weeks long. The president says there's a deal, but we've kind of seen this movie before. ACA subsidies.
No, we've seen this going back to when Speaker Boehner was negotiating with the Obama administration to fund DHS and the Obama administration's approach to immigration. So this is not new. What we did there was fund the government fully with an appropriations package and have a continuing resolution for DHS because we couldn't get agreement. We're having a similar situation here, but there is an idea within the Senate senators that are having cross-party conversations that they can come to a reasonable conclusion on a few policies that would enable a full funding for DHS for the remainder of the year. The timeline of 2 weeks seems crazy if you're in the market or if you're in the real world, but for Washington and for the legislative process on Capitol Hill, that is like saying we're going to have on Monday a deal. I mean, it's effectively working over the weekend to get a deal. So the condensed timeline is for the purpose of driving pressure to limit the number of policies that ride and to build consensus between the legislative branch, both parties, and the White House. So I think you're going to see next week, by Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, a deal come to fruition, or we're going to see disaster at DHS.
Wow, all right.
This, in order to fund the government, you're going to have a week-long process to actually.
So forget 2 weeks. This needs to be done next week.
Yes.
Can they do it without Chip Roy and members of the Freedom Caucus?
Yes. Well, I mean, if they can either be a constructive part of the conversation or they can be on the outside. The Senate procedures here will drive to a conclusion of 60 to 80 votes, probably 70 to 80 on a DHS funding mechanism. In the House, you can see a similar vote, but that would eliminate the far progressive left and those dissidents on the right that don't want to be a part of the legislative process.
Interesting. Should we start getting used to saying Chair Warsh?
I think what's interesting right now, and you just heard it, I mean, with your interview,
Elizabeth Warren says there shouldn't even be a hearing until this investigation is completed into Jay Powell.
Well, there are a couple issues. So let's before we get into Kevin Warsh, we have the issue of the president getting his appointees through the Senate Banking Committee. It is a very simple thing when you have the majority to get your nominees through the committee because you have the votes, or the majority party has a majority in committees. But the majority in the Senate is narrow, so there's a one-vote majority by Republicans in the Senate Banking Committee. So then then the question is, where are the Republican senators on this to process any nominee for the Fed to the floor? You've interviewed Senator Tillis, my home state senator, who has expressed himself in very vocal terms that no nominee will get his vote until this Powell investigation ends. He means it. He's not running for re-election. There's nothing anyone can do to him in order to other than convince him, right, or negotiate with him. They can't punish him in any way. He's leaving. He's retiring. He's a liberated person. Like, he is one of the happiest people I know in Washington right now that holds any power. And he holds serious power in committee.
He does at the moment.
So you have to remedy that. I don't think Elizabeth Warren is a undecided vote here. I think she'll find any justification to vote no on any one of the president's nominees. Even Kevin Warsh, who was last in government as a George W. Bush Republican nominee and confirmed choice to the Fed.
Well, Democrats are calling him a flip-flopper. She says that he's changed his tune. He was a hawk, he's now a dove, and he's going to do anything the president asks him to do. She referred to whomever Donald Trump picks as a sock puppet. That's obviously not your view. But should there be a hearing before the investigation resumes? And I guess before you answer that, I asked the current chairman, the man who has zero job now, French Hill, about this today. He joined us earlier on Bloomberg. Can we hear what French Hill had to say? Let's watch and listen.
I hope that calmer heads will prevail on this investigation around Jay Powell, and that we don't have Warsh's nomination held up because of that. And I hope that the DOJ can more promptly review the data, review their decision, and take a final decision on their whether or not they're going to pursue the case. I just want people to know publicly this is, as I say, a distraction and could delay President Trump's own macroeconomic agenda.
Calls it a distraction, hopes calmer heads will prevail. Will this hasten an end to that investigation now that there's a pick?
I think so. And I think Senator Tillis's vote hastens the end to it. Not with the comments Elizabeth Warren made, but the vote of Tom Tillis and his relative position of actually being in the capacity of being a no or a yes. That gives him great wiggle room. But what you've heard from French Hill is a very sensible approach to the Federal Reserve vis-a-vis the legislative branch. But the eyes here are on Senate negotiations around nominees. That is always a delicate, bespoke process for any White House, but especially with this narrow majority in the U.S. Senate, and especially with a one-vote majority in the Senate Banking Committee.
Could we be in a world in which there's a hearing and then we wait for an investigation to end before we vote? Or how does this unfold for you?
I think that could happen. I think that, but I don't think you're likely to see the question put before the committee and it fail. I don't think that's in Republicans' interest. I don't think Senator Tillis would think that's wise. I don't think the White House would think it's wise.
Interesting.
This White House, interestingly enough, got all their nominees through to the cabinet, even the ones that looked the most challenged, even the ones that were so counter to the ideology, the stated ideology of the Congress and the White House. They made their way through a divided Senate. I think likewise we're going to see the president get his nominee Kevin Warsh through. I think we'll see we'll see the end of this investigation of the Federal Reserve, and I think we'll see a statement by the Supreme Court about the independence of the Fed. So at the end of the next 6 months, we're going to look back at a Federal Reserve more independent, more locked in its independency than it was before, regardless of the rhetoric among Democratic politicians on that.
Does Jay Powell hang out for the rest of his time on the Fed? Because some have suggested he would never leave now to give President Trump the majority.
It's in his power, and this is power he possesses.
You know him better than most.
And what I would say is this, too, is a negotiation.
Interesting.
And it's in the art of the deal, if you want to say it that way.
We've got a lot to learn here still. By the way, Bloomberg News has confirmed what we were just discussing with the congressman. A vote in the House will take place Monday. So what happens here this evening is critically important with Senate votes underway right now. We've got less than a minute left. What's the speaker in for on Monday?
A rough day.
Yeah?
A rough day because the proposition for the House, they did the work to fund this. Events overtook them, and the Senate is railroading them. It does not feel good when all the action's in the Senate and you're riding shotgun.
How about that?
When you're riding shotgun, it means you're the crank yelling at the driver, right? Yeah. And that is what has happened for the House in this. The deal making's been in the Senate. They've figured out a process that will prevail, and the president will sign this bill that the Senate's going to pass tonight. Yep. The House will deal with it, but it's always how that happens. It's a delicate piece for any speaker.
Don't make plans next week. We're going to need it.
No, thanks.
Could have a deal next week, or at least we're going to need one, according to Patrick McHenry, the former congressman, former chairman, former speaker pro tem. We thank you, as always, for being with us. And we've got a lot more coming up here on Capitol Hill. As voting gets underway in the Senate, stay with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I said, it's going to be a Kevin, but, Kevin really has been fantastic at the White House. You all know him. You know him very well. And so we have Kevin W. This is, in the whole country, I would say that this was the, perfect candidate. This was not a surprise or anything. This was the man that's most qualified.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Tyler Kendall in our D.C. bureau with Joe Matthew on Capitol Hill tonight. And that was the president earlier today offering praise for Kevin Warsh, his pick to succeed Jerome Powell as the next Federal Reserve chair. The nomination will go in front of the Senate Banking Committee, and Committee Chair Tim Scott says he expects to hold hearings in a timely manner, even though one key senator is threatening to block that process. For a view from the White House and how the administration arrived at this decision after months of anticipation, let's go now to Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who joins us live from the White House North Lawn. So, Kate, can you just take us through what this process actually looked like, how we got to this determination that the pick was going to be Kevin Warsh? Because we saw President Trump post on Truth Social in tandem his praise for NEC Chair Kevin Hassett, who he says he didn't want to lose as a top economic messenger for this administration.
Yeah, we've been hearing several different names for quite a while now. But, as we heard from the president today, we heard a lot of praise from the president about his ultimate choice for the Fed chair job, Kevin Warsh. He said that Warsh wants to cut interest rates. This is something that the president has been talking about publicly for a very long time. It's, as you know, Tyler, at the heart of his issue with the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell. So he has made it no secret that he wants the next Fed chair to cut interest rates. At the same time, the president today said that he did not explicitly talk to Warsh about this, did not directly ask him to cut rates. He said that he thought it would be inappropriate for him to do so. Another thing that you mentioned, Tyler, the Tom Tillis block, the president didn't seem too concerned about what Tillis had said, though that definitely will complicate things for the White House, complicate this nomination process. It's definitely something that they're going to have to address moving forward.
Well, Kate, more breaking news tonight. The Wall Street Journal reporting that President Trump has decided on his pick to lead the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Brett Matsumoto, considered a career staffer at the BLS. Can you just remind us why this position has been so contentious after President Trump had to pull his previous nominee, E.J. Antoni, back in September?
Absolutely. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has not had a chief. The president was frustrated with numbers that showed, bad news about the job market. What we do know is that the Wall Street Journal is reporting that the president plans to nominate Brett Matsumoto is his pick for the job. Matsumoto has been with the BLS since 2015. He spent much of the past year at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He's a career staffer, is now elevated reportedly to lead a key economic agency, pending Senate confirmation, of course.
And Kate, of course, today has been a big domestic policy day, but we would be remiss if we didn't mention some of the foreign policy headlines that happened, including that a U.S. carrier strike group has arrived in the Middle East. Can you just give us the latest update as President Trump weighs action in Iran, from potential military strikes to keeping diplomacy maybe on the table?
Absolutely. So I asked the president this in the Oval Office today. I asked, is there a deadline that you're giving Iran before considering or before carrying out potential military strikes? He said that that's something that only Iran knows. I asked, have you communicated this directly to them? He said he has. We do not know what that deadline is. The president seems to want to pursue the diplomatic route, but he definitely has all options on the table and has been posting about sending a massive armada to the region. So definitely weighing a range of military options at this point.
All right, Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan live for us tonight from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. And we want to stick with domestic policy now and turn back to the significance of Kevin Warsh being nominated to lead the Federal Reserve. And for a preview of what we can expect policy-wise from the central bank, we're joined now from Bloomberg's Enda Curran. Enda, thanks for being here. And of course, you have the byline on the Bloomberg terminal that looks into Kevin Warsh's past. And you write that he ran the race with a promise of, quote, regime change. What does that mean, and what can we actually expect from him policy-wise as he approaches this post to lead the central bank?
Well, President Trump has set the table here that he wants interest rates to be lower. Even if he says he didn't explicitly ask for it, he wants lower interest rates. Now, Mr. Warsh has come to this job speaking about how the economy can have lower interest rates, partly because he's talking about this technology-driven, AI-driven productivity boom, which where you'll see faster growth with slower inflation, and that will allow the Fed to bring down interest rates. He's also talking about shaking up the Fed's balance sheet, making it much smaller, much less intervention into the bond market. So these are big talking points from the incoming or from the nominated Fed chair. The issue there are two things to think about here, Tyler. Number one, the economy will need to cooperate with him. Remember, the Fed cut rates 3 times last year, but only after a lot of debate. Several policymakers were worried inflation still remains too high. It's above the Fed's 2% target. They're worried about that. Secondly, the Fed talks about the labour market might be stabilising now. So that's why they're on hold. If in a few months' time the labour market's weak and inflation is slowing, then Mr. Warsh will have a green light to push the case for rate cuts. But if in a few months' time we get to a point where unemployment is still stable and inflation is still persistent or sticky, then he's going to have a much tougher job persuading everyone else at the Fed that they should be cutting interest rates. So it's going to be a challenging few months ahead for him, I think.
So that's the view on monetary policy. What about structural changes potentially to the institution itself when we hear about him maybe pulling back from bank supervision? We're also hearing about a potential new accord between the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury Department. What should we be watching out in that space?
Well, we haven't had specific details, but we've had caustic language, certainly very direct criticism of the Fed by Mr. Warsh over the past year in terms of interviews and columns that he has written. He has used the term regime change, for example. He has been very critical of the Fed in terms of what he views as policy errors. And of course, remember the backdrop being that the Treasury Secretary, Mr. Bessent, is also critical of the Fed. And he's specifically talking about shaking up perhaps the way the regional Fed presidents are appointed. He has spoken about staffing arrangements at the Fed. So all of these things are in the mix. We don't quite know yet where Mr. Warsh will come down on any one of these things. Now, to be clear, it should be said there are plenty of people who think the Fed is in need of some kind of a shake-up, given the inflation story over the past few years, the SVB banking failure over the past few years. And not everyone is willing to die in a ditch for the Fed in its status quo. But we do know that Mr. Warsh is coming to the job having used some fairly strident language in terms of how he thinks about the central bank.
I'm glad you brought up the makeup of the broader Fed, because I have to ask you about what all this means for the future of the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell. What are we watching for as we know that he's weighing whether or not to stay on, since his post as a governor doesn't end for another 2 years?
It's a big subplot. Normally, the Fed chair, when their term ends, they leave the building. They head off and enjoy retirement. Most Fed watchers were expecting Mr. Powell to do that. The story behind the scenes here now, of course, or that exploded into public view, is the Department of Justice investigation into the Fed and Chair Powell over the renovations of their building. That is A, unprecedented and shocking. B, the Fed is saying that's a pretext for an attack on their independence. And then C, Fed watchers, people who look at the Fed every day for a living, say this might convince Mr. Powell to remain on the board. While his term as chair finishes in May, he's allowed to stay on the Fed's board until the start of 2028. And people are now thinking he might stay on the board to try and thwart or fight back against that DOJ investigation, to try and work towards cushioning the Fed against any overt political interference from the White House. And of course, if he stays in place, that narrows Mr. Trump's options to get more supporters of his own onto the board in terms of how to bring down interest rates and change up the Fed. So it's quite a few moving pieces there, but Mr. Powell's decision will be critical in all of that.
Right, because what does this mean for current Fed Chair Stephen Miran, whose term is supposed to be up tomorrow? Because it's our understanding he's going to stay on for a little while until at least Warsh is confirmed. What's sort of that moving chess piece, as you referred to? Governor
Miran was a key Trump appointee to this board. He's been advocating for big interest rate cuts, so he's all on board Trump's efforts to reshape the Fed. As you say, his term is up. It had been expected that perhaps he could stay in situ, carry on remaining on the board of the Fed, if Mr. Powell was to leave the board, because that would free up a seat for Mr. Warsh to come in as chair. The issue now is if Mr. Powell is going to stay on the board. We don't know. He has not publicly said what he's going to do, but if Mr. Powell stays there, that gives Mr. Trump fewer options in terms of trying to move the musical chairs around. So Mr. Miran will have to leave. Warsh takes his seat, and that's how it moves on. I mean, to be clear, there's palace intrigue here. It's kind of like a musical chairs at the Fed's policy board, but it's quite, Mr. Powell's decision, what he decides, will be consequential for all these other pieces that I've spoken about.
Well said. Bloomberg's Enda Curran, who helps lead our coverage of the Fed and the economy. Thank you, as always. And let's head back now to Capitol Hill, where Joe Matthew is monitoring the breaking news as the Senate votes on funding bills that could avert a partial government shutdown. Hey, Joe.
Yeah, hey, Tyler, it's probably not going to avert a shutdown. In fact, we'll probably have a brief shutdown, remembering that there's a 2-week continuing resolution that they're going to be voting on for the Department of Homeland Security. All the other 5 agencies that are in this funding bill are going to pass. The House is coming back over the weekend, and this is an important update, Tyler. There's going to be a vote in the House on Monday. So lawmakers are going to have to find their way back to Washington on Sunday for a 6:30 p.m. vote, as we understand it. That will require a 2/3 majority to pass. That's the state of play. Senators are on the floor right now working through amendments, and we'll let you know when this bill gets to the floor, the big one. Stay with us. Breaking news continuing with a live view of the Senate floor on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Much more on today's top stories when our political panel joins up ahead. But first, here are the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. First, the Justice Department released another trove of files related to Jeffrey Epstein today in the latest effort to comply with November's order for the files to be made public. Friday's release includes over 3 million pages of documents, 180,000 photographs, and 2,000 videos. Plus, President Trump is threatening a new 50% tariff on aircraft from Canada in retaliation for what he says is Canada's refusal to certify certain American-made Gulfstream jets. The threat could put a big dent in Canadian plane makers' growing sales, since the U.S. is private aviation's biggest market. Canadian officials said Friday they were in touch with U.S. regulators and expect the president's complaints to be resolved. And former CNN anchor Don Lemon was arrested by federal agents in Los Angeles today in connection with his coverage of a protest against ICE operations in Minnesota. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi said in a post on X that she had ordered the arrest of Lemon and 3 others over what she described as a, quote, coordinated attack on a church in St. Paul, Minnesota. Lemon, now an independent journalist, covered the January 18th protest at City's Church, which was targeted because one of the pastors is allegedly an official at the local ICE office. To discuss all of the day's major news, our panel tonight, Annalise Keller, Republican strategist and partner at 7 Letter PR, and Jeannie Shanzano, Democracy Visiting Fellow and Harvard Ash Center, and a Bloomberg Politics contributor. Annalise, let's start with you, and let's start with the breaking news right now as we are waiting the Senate to vote and where negotiations are going when it comes to a partial government shutdown. What does it say to you that the White House was willing to negotiate on this, on potential curbs to ICE? Considering the last shutdown, it seemed like neither of the sides wanted to engage.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key flashing light to me, that the White House understands that they've really lost the narrative when it comes to what ICE is doing in Minneapolis and, in Maine and other places across the country. I think that's kind of the key thing to keep your eye on. And you're absolutely right. Last time when the shutdown was going on, the White House was completely disengaged, let Congress negotiate with Democrats. And that's, in this case, Senate Republicans got completely rolled. I mean, this has been a little tricky for them to pass. I don't know if you were following it last night, but there were a lot of senators who had a lot of holds, a lot of people who were frustrated that, they essentially had to learn about this package through a Truth Social post from Donald Trump. That's not typically how the Senate operates and does its business. So I think there's some frustration there. But now looking forward, the big thing to watch is whether or not the House is going to be able to get this done. They had already passed this package. It flipped to the House, it flipped to the Senate. And now, because they changed it, it has to go back to the House. And this is going to be really difficult for Mike Johnson. He has really tight margins.
Well, to that point, actually, Annalise, should we be concerned that House conservatives are going to be making their own demands? How complicated could this actually get?
It's going to get really complicated. So Mike Johnson, and this is a little wonky, but he has said that he wants to pass this on suspensions. So the really tricky part of this is to go through the Rules Committee, which there are a lot of those sort of far-right Republicans that sit on that committee that make it really difficult to get. That's kind of how you get a bill to the floor. So this Rules Committee, what they're going to try to do is put it on suspension. So that would mean that it would require 2/3 of the House of Representatives to vote in favor of it. So it's going to need a lot of Democratic support. Mike Johnson had a call with his conference today and was just begging members to make sure that they got into town because there's also a lot of bad weather. And so it's really going to be sort of a confluence of challenges for the House to, we're going to have a partial shutdown for a couple of days, but hopefully they're going to vote, I think, on Monday at 6:30. And if they can get it done, then the government will reopen.
Well, Jeannie, to Annalise's point before about how many of these Senate Republicans learned about this deal coming together from the president's post on Truth Social, what's been your assessment of how Democratic leadership has handled this? There had been criticism about Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer's handling of prior shutdowns. And how much of those demands that Democrats put on the table do you think are actually going to come out in a final compromise when it comes to DHS funding down the road?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking a lot today about, and Annalise is absolutely right, this is going to be tough for Mike Johnson to get this through the House, but that only buys us 2 weeks on this really difficult negotiation ahead on ICE and what's going to happen with that funding. And I think to your point, Tyler, it is very questionable how much they can agree to. We've already heard certain senators, I'm thinking, for instance, like Rick Scott, who say, you know what, we don't want to handicap ICE. So there is going to be some pushback. I think they may get agreement on some things, but there is going to be a lot of pushback from the Senate. And then let's not forget, this package was negotiated. So when it goes back to the House finally, the second one, if they do get it, you're going to see Democrats and Republicans asking for certain things that they wanted before and left on the table. So we're by no means, in the home stretch here. And in the meantime, the irony of this entire endeavor is that ICE is funded at records that we have never seen before. They got $75 billion in the big, beautiful bill. So while DHS is going to be underfunded until they get an agreement on this thing, ICE is perfectly capable of going ahead for a good amount of time with what they have, which amounts to, in some people's estimation, more than the Israeli government. So it's a lot of money that they're already sitting on.
Annalise, what is actually going to be palatable, do you think, in a future compromise? And is this stopgap measure going to be enough time to actually bring us to a point where we will see tangible legislation and these changes codified into law?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the big question. I'm not sure. Jeannie's exactly right that about $75 billion was given to ICE. So it's not really an issue of funding. A couple of things that they're asking for that I think Dems are going to go forward with in the interim. They're going to move forward with their impeachment of Kristi Noem, which I think is going to sort of run tangentially to what's going on here with their requests. Schumer has put out a few requests through this DHS process. He wants to, have body cameras, warrants, things like that. I think there are some of those things that they can build some consensus around, but it's going to be, I think, difficult to get Democrats to be completely comfortable to a place where they're happy, and Republicans are going to feel like they have some leverage, so they're not going to want to give up what they feel like is sort of too much to Democrats in this process.
Well, we also have to ask you both about, of course, the other big news today. Kevin Warsh is the Fed pick. Take a listen. Earlier in the program, Joe Matthew sat down with Senator Elizabeth Warren, the ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee, which will take this nomination first. Here's a listen to what she had to say about the president's pick.
Donald Trump has made clear he does not want an independent Fed. He wants a Fed that acts like a sock puppet for him. He has threatened to fire Jerome Powell. He started a bogus investigation of another member of the Fed, Lisa Cook. And he has said openly he will not name anyone to be Fed chair who does not agree with Donald Trump. Donald Trump wants to be calling the shots. In other words, he said he wants a sock puppet, and evidently Kevin Warsh just passed that test.
But, Jeannie, when we hear from the key Republican who is blocking this nomination on Senate Banking, Tom Tillis, he talks about how he actually thinks that Warsh is a good Fed pick and that he would have had his vote, except for that he's going to block it over the process. It's not necessarily about the pick, it's about the process. So how should we expect this to ultimately play out? Is it more a question of when, not if, for Kevin Warsh's pick?
I think so, Tyler. You know, it's fascinating because under any other circumstance, I think Warsh, and he's been considered before, as young as he is, he's been considered before. He's a very strong pick, and I think there's a lot of people who are very supportive of the pick. I think the concern, of course, is the investigation into Jerome Powell, Donald Trump's consistent pushing on trying to manipulate the interest rates and trying to call Jerome Powell to the mat, and of course, to criticize him for not doing Donald Trump's bidding. That's all now hanging over Kevin Warsh. So I think under other circumstances, he'd be very welcome and very strong pick. But I think the confirmation process is going to involve a lot of questions about how are you going to maintain your independence given the amount of pressure we've seen Donald Trump put on your predecessor. And I think it's a fair question to ask. And I think Kevin Warsh is going to be very good at answering it. But it is a fair question to ask given how much pressure we've seen Donald Trump put on Jerome Powell so far.
Final minute, Annalise, what's your assessment here, considering that we knew some of those other options on the table might not have been viable, like the NEC director, Kevin Hassett?
Yeah, I think this is going to go forward. I think Tom Tillis will end up backing off, but there will be, a lot of questions that will need to be answered, and people will need to feel comfortable through that confirmation process. But Jeannie is spot on. I think her assessment's absolutely right.
All right. Our political panel tonight, Annalise Keller and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you both so much. And we want to check back in with Joe Matthew, who's on Capitol Hill and is monitoring all of the breaking news as the Senate votes remain underway. Joe, what's the latest?
This is the real stuff that's coming here, Tyler. They're working their way through a number of amendments right now. There's a Bernie Sanders amendment that's on the floor that would, in fact, rescind money, would take money already appropriated for ICE. And beyond that, there is a Merkley amendment that they will address that would prevent rescissions like we saw last year of monies that have already been appropriated. Then we wind up to the full smash and a floor vote that will likely take place, we're hearing, around 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. Now, Tyler, we have to remind everybody that even if this passes tonight, and it is expected to widely, even if some of these votes don't come terribly easily, the government will still shut down because the House needs to come back to codify what the Senate is taking care of. Lawmakers, we understand, will be heading back to Washington, D.C. on Sunday, and we will likely have a vote. The plan, at least for now, is the Speaker wants to see a vote 6:30 p.m. Monday evening. If that all takes place, the government shutdown will just be a couple of days long, considering a long weekend here. But then the negotiations will begin that you were just talking about with the panel over the course of 2 weeks to hammer out these new restrictions on ICE. That may not come as easily as some are assuming here. And even if that deal is struck, it may not be that easily passed in the House. So, Tyler, we still have a lot of questions to answer here. And I think Elizabeth Warren did a pretty good job raising some of these concerns that Democrats have here. And we got a pretty good reality check from Patrick McHenry while we were at it. He said a deal must be struck by end of next week to allow procedural votes to take place and actually get that on the House floor the week later. So 2 weeks, Tyler. It's going to go by pretty quick.
And a shutdown at midnight would mark the second time that Congress has failed to fund the government, even if it is just partial under this second Trump term. Joe, very quickly here, what are we hearing from the House's point of view and whether or not they could complicate this process, even if they do come back? And they will come back on Monday.
It's the House, so I'd expect something complicated. Look, there are a lot of members of the Republican conference, particularly in the House, who do not like this idea at all. Chip Roy being one of them. The Freedom Caucus could give Speaker Johnson some concern. So I suspect there's going to be a lot of phone calling over the weekend, and it might just be a man named Donald Trump on the other end of the line. We'll keep you posted on everything that we learn here on Balance of Power. Tyler Kendall in our Washington bureau. Tyler, I'll have much more on this as we learn it. I'm Joe Matthew on Capitol Hill. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.